Nehemiah chapter 5. We'll step back into here on Wednesday nights. Continue through our preaching through the book of Nehemiah. And just as a short recap, Nehemiah has been called by God and gets the opportunity. And actually, that's one thing that I want to point out here really quick is that many times main characters of the Bible will have a moment, will have a call. Moses and Elijah, many of these guys, many of the Old Testament prophets had times in which God spoke to them and called them out and called them for a particular purpose and sent them on that way. And the Bible records that, and they end up doing great things for God. But Nehemiah is a very interesting character, is that before the opportunity arises in all of this, God never calls Nehemiah. This is not recorded. Nehemiah doesn't have that moment where, God's booming voice comes out of the sky, or the angel speaks to him, or the voice of the Lord comes to him, or the fiery, burning bush. He doesn't have any of that. And I do believe that God remains, one, balanced in how He deals with things, but then two, also varied in how He calls people. We have a tendency sometimes in Christianity to say that because my salvation experience doesn't exactly fit this, then, well, maybe I'm not saved. Or my calling in this, or my experience in surrendering to God, or whatever it may be. One of the things that we should be very thankful about is that God deals with people individually. And your relationship with God, while obviously there are fundamental things that need to be there. If you don't read your Bible, if you don't pray, you don't at least try to spend some amount of time, with God in that sense, then you can't tell me that your relationship is right. Okay? But at the same time, your amount of Bible study or your amount of reading or your time in prayer in a certain place, if that doesn't seem the exact same way as somebody else, that's okay. God deals with us in different ways, and God handles us in different ways. And I would say this, that many times we are looking as Christian people for the giant booming voice to come out of the sky to call us into something great. When in reality, God just wants willing people to be ready to work whenever it comes across. Nehemiah got into doing the job that God had for him because he was one just willing to look around and jump in wherever is needed. And I do believe that attitude or that mentality right there is most important for the church. I believe that if I could cultivate anything in the life of the members of our church, is to stop looking for a burning bush and look for a wall that needs built. Stop waiting for the grand voice to come down and to call you to be a missionary or to call you to do this or to call you to do that. It's just simply look around, and when the opportunity arises, step in and take it. That's it. That's all that's there. And so that's what Nehemiah did. He was just simply serving God where he was at, in Babylon, out and about, all over the place, was not even in Jerusalem, but was just simply serving God where he was supposed to be at, and the opportunity arose, he prayed about it, and he took it. Simple. You say, what is that? That's serving God. That's serving God. And so then he gets everything that he needs, and he comes back, and he has experienced some success in building the walls. The rubble's starting to be removed. The walls are starting to be joined. Although the walls are not completed yet, in the last chapter we find out that as those breaches begin to close and come together, that Sanballat and Tobiah and the enemies of the nation of Israel start to come out against the nation there to hinder the work. And what is that? That just needs to be expected. When you do anything for God, you just need to expect trouble from the outside. But what happens here in Nehemiah chapter 5 is that the next problem that comes is not an invading army that can be dealt with swords and spears and bows. What begins to develop, is trouble from within. And it is amazing to me how how God puts together certain messages and the timing and all this. I would love to say that I was spiritual enough to plan this entire year of Titus and Galatians and Nehemiah and building and, getting ready to expand the auditorium and maybe put a building, adding on and the parking and all. I would love to say that I timed all of these messages for that particular way, and that's just God. And what I want to preach to you tonight is this, that anytime you step into, I'm going to use the quote-unquote term, building program in that sense, you need to expect and be ready for trouble to occur. Why is that? Because it's one thing to have trouble from your coworkers or your family or friends or whatever it is, but it's another thing when God's people begin to come together and then the money begins to come in and the unity begins to develop and the camaraderie begins to come in, and the devil knows that Christian people are stronger together than you are apart. And so the attack is not going to be from the outside in, it's going to be from the inside out. And the devil's going to begin to come in, and he's going to begin to cause some problems within the church. And why is that? Why? Because if he can destroy the unity of the church, then the church can accomplish nothing when they're disunified. If people are constantly fighting and bickering back and forth, and everybody's trying to get a leg up on somebody else, you can't do the work when it's in that state. All right, or it's going to be very much hindered and slowed down. And so we're going to just preach through here of Nehemiah chapter 5. We're going to start reading in verse 1 and read down to verse 6 to start off with. And it says this, "And there was a great cry of the people and of their wives against their brethren the Jews. For there were that said, We our sons and our daughters are many, therefore we take up corn for them that we may eat and live. Some also there that said, We have mortgaged our lands, vineyards, and houses, that we might buy corn because of the dearth. There were also that said, We have borrowed money for the king's tribute, and that upon our lands and our vineyards. Yet now is our flesh as the flesh of our brethren, and our children as their children. And lo, we bring into bondage our sons and our daughters to be servants, and some of our daughters are brought into bondage already. Neither is it in our power to redeem them, for other men have our lands and vineyards. And I was very angry when I heard their cry and these words." Some problems begin to develop within the nation of Israel that seek to hinder the work far more effectively than an outside army ever could. You understand that when outside forces begin to put pressure on, that can, cause problems within. But most of the time, what happens is it causes people to close ranks and become closer together. Outside problems, typically, if they're handled right, will produce a stronger church, a more unified church. That is the example of church history. Anytime the devil has brought about intense persecution, outside persecution on Christians, it has developed a stronger, more faithful church. Nobody wants to hear that, and nobody wants to experience that, but that's just simply the truth. But what happens, what has become most effective in bringing about problems within the church is when there's problems in the church, not outside the church. You know what the first things that's going to come about? And this is just kind of as a warning message, if you will, just to, hey, you need to be aware of it, you need to be thinking about it, you need to know it so you don't get blindsided, is that as we begin to go forward and we maybe do some things in expansion and we maybe try to reach some more of our community and we try to do some more ministry outward related things, you know what the first thing you're going to have to realize is life in general is just going to get tough. You know what he says in verse 2 here? He says that the people say this, "We our sons and our daughters are many, therefore we take up corn for them that we may eat and live." You say, well, what's the big deal about that? You know what? Sometimes it's hard to just simply keep life going when you're doing a whole bunch of other work. And when you try to do the work, you know what happens when you sign up to do a Sunday school class, or you sign up to teach this, or you sign up to take responsibility in this particular way, then all of a sudden, everything else in life gets compounded by the extra pressure that now just got put on. And you need to be aware of that. You need to recognize that. Why is that? Because that's going to begin to cause problems inside of you, because now you have to face a question of priority that says, when this goes down, or when this happens, or when this problem begins to develop, am I going to maintain this priority that I just set? It's very easy to allow the priority of church and all other things to come about, even for good quote-unquote things that are out there. But I just want to warn you that if we desire to do something, and we desire to grow, and we desire to maybe do some building things, you just mark it down right now that your life out there is going to get rough. The job's going to get crazy. The family's going to get crazy. Everything about it is just going to become 10 times worse. Why is that? Because if he can distract you with that, then when you step into church, you're not in a frame of mind to worship God. You're not in a frame of mind to serve one another and to help one another. Secondly, he says this in verse 3. It says, "Some also that were there that said, We have mortgaged our lands, vineyards, and houses, that we might buy corn because of the dearth." A dearth is just a death of the land. It's a famine. It's a dry spell, a drought in that way, in which the crops weren't producing the way they were supposed to. They weren't getting the rains at the right time. Things were just not growing, and they weren't able to get the amount of bushels of corn per acre that they were looking for. And now all of a sudden they're entering into a dry time in their life. And when you try to make that commitment to do something for God, and if you want to experience this, just go ahead and make the commitment right now that you're gonna read the Bible in a certain amount of time. And as soon as life all around you decides to get tough, and you power through that, then all of a sudden you're going to sit down to your Bible and you're going to read it, and you're going to be like, this is boring. I'm not getting anything out of it. My prayer life doesn't seem to be going anywhere. This doesn't seem to be going anywhere. Church doesn't seem to be going anywhere. You say, well, what is it? It's just a dry time in your life. You say, well, how do I get this dry time out of my life? You just go through it. I would love to say that there's one secret thing to turn the water on, but in reality, we all have to experience dry times in our life. We have to experience those times in which stuff's not working right, things aren't doing what they're supposed to be, you haven't heard from God in a while, and you know what? Sometimes it's a result of sin, and sometimes it's just because you're trying to do something from God, and we're in the midst of a war. And what the enemy tries to do more often than anything else is to cut off the supply line, cut off the communication, cut off all the things that allow you to do what you're supposed to do. And sometimes when you start in on building for God, you're going to go through just some tough times in general. You're going to go through some dry times. But then verse 4, it says this, "There were also that said, We have borrowed money for the king's tribute, and that upon our lands and our vineyards." You know what? Sometimes you're going to go through taxing times. You're going to go through times in which it seems like life is trying to get more out of you than you have able to give to it. You're going to go through times in which it's going to take more out of you than you think you can handle. You try to serve God and you try to make some commitments for God, and then all of a sudden, one of the greatest problems in your life is going to pop up, and you're going to sit there and go, I don't think I can handle this. You know what? That's a taxing time. And all of those will develop. You think, this doesn't sound very pleasant. I thought we were just going to build and grow and have this wonderful time. All right, there's joy that comes in the morning, but the night can be long sometimes. And it's better, I can go through the night if I know morning's coming. But it's when you don't know morning's coming and the pressure gets put on and everything. It's one thing, you can handle pressure if you know there's an end to it. And so I just want to remind you this, that as we go forward, we try to do something for God, you try to make commitments to God, everything about it is going to come against it. In verse 5, you know what happens? They end up, their children and their sons and their daughters end up going into bondage. You know what will happen? You choose to serve God, and all of a sudden your teenager that was just fine turns into a little hellion. All of a sudden, you took them to church, you did all the things you're supposed to do, and all of a sudden you try to institute some things into your family or into the things that you're trying to do, and now all of a sudden they go off the deep end this way or they go off the deep end that way, and you know what it is? It will attack the fellowship. And when it comes to the church, you know what will happen is that as we try to go forward and do some things for God and work towards maybe some building projects in those sort of ways, you know what's going to happen? The number one attack is going to come in to try to set you against somebody else in the church. And that could be your best friend, it could be somebody you don't even know, and you'll walk by, and all of a sudden they'll stop talking and look your way, and in the back of your mind there's that little voice that goes, she was talking about me. It was like, no, she just had to take a breath at that moment because she hadn't stopped for 4 minutes before there. But the voice begins to come in and say, well, he's doing this and she's doing that, and why are they doing it this way? And that questioning spirit begins to develop and to permeate into the relationships of the church, and it begins to pit one against another. What you find out here as you keep reading down through the rest of this chapter is that the ones that are doing the bondage and the ones that are causing the problems are their own brethren. They've become short up on money. They need the money to feed their family, and so they have to go borrow money for the king's tribute, or they have to go borrow money to feed their family. And you know what happens is their own Jewish brothers loan them the money and say, all right, that's going to be 20% interest now. And according to Jewish law, they could loan the money, but they were not allowed to put interest with it. Usury was against the law when it came to, now you could charge a Gentile usury, you could charge foreign nations usury, but when it came time to how brother treated brother, there was no usury allowed. And what's happened here now is that certain people are taking advantage of other people in the midst of this time when everybody should be focused on the building, when everybody should be focused on repairing the city and putting worship back in order and serving God together. And now all of a sudden one guy's trying to figure out what he can get out of the other guy. What is it? It's an attack on our fellowship. It's an attempt to pit brother against brother. Why do they have to say that? Or why do they get to do that? Or why did they get their name called out? And why didn't they get that name called out? And why? Hey, you know what? If you're not willing to go search for the answer of why and deal with the issue, then the why question doesn't need to stay in your mind. The why question that you constantly roll over in your mind is not meant for information. It's meant to stir up your emotions. That just came to me, and that's very profound. How many times do we sit and stew over the question why? Instead of going to the person and figuring out, we just sit there and run through the thousands of different scenarios. And now all of a sudden we are mentally and emotionally exhausted because we've ran through every 1,000 scenarios of why that particular thing happened, when if we would have just gone, talked to them, dealt with it, and it was over, we'd be good. But that why question, if it's not dealt with quickly, turns into a very dangerous thing. And so what's happened to what Nehemiah does here, and we're going to look at some ways, how do we avoid this trouble? How do we avoid the trouble that's going to come naturally when we try to do something for God? And it took a little longer in the introduction than I thought, so I'm just going to give you three quick things here. First off, in verse 6, Nehemiah shows some things here, is this, in verse 6, and he says, and I was very angry. Okay? My point is not that you should be angry, but it is this, that you should have a right attitude about the situation. You know, the situation of a Jewish brother charging another Jewish brother usury up into the level of, at one point he makes them, they're going to end up pay their brothers back in the usury, and that comes out to the 100th part, and then multiplied over, they were somewhere in the realm of 12 to 20% interest they were charging their brother. They were loan sharking one another. And at that point, when Nehemiah hears this, he responds to that situation correctly. He's angry about it. He should have been angry about it. It was a transgression of God's law. It was hindering the work. It was causing problems between one another. And you know what we have to have in order to combat trouble that may develop within the church, within our families, as we try to go forward with God, is that we need to maintain a right attitude about some situations in our lives. There are some situations you need to be angry about. If somebody comes to you and begins to gossip or to undermine, well, this person did that, and that person does this, and this person does that, you ought to be angry about that. You ought to look him in the eye and say, I don't want to hear it. It's in the Proverbs, and I can't find the exact, I'll find it and give it to you. But you know what typically shuts down gossip pretty quick? Somebody that will rebuke it. And rebuke it harshly. We need to have a right attitude about things. Was it also on the flip side of that? We need to have the right attitude about some things and recognize that some things aren't a big deal. So what? They didn't put your potato salad on the front part of the table instead of the back side of the table. Who cares? Why is it that this, you see, what is it? It's all a right attitude. There are times to be angry, and there are times not to be angry. And the way in which we steer clear of trouble here, if you will, when it comes to this program and how we're trying to do certain things, I even hate that word building program in that way, but just for sake of the illustration of what's going on here in Nehemiah and where we're at, is that we need to maintain a right attitude about the things that are going on. You say, well, are we going to have a business meeting with 5 meetings and all the 6 different choices of carpet colors and all? No. You say, well, what if I don't like the carpet? It's not in your house. You see, but something as minuscule as the color of the carpet that you will probably never notice again can cause problems within a church. Well, what about this? What about this? Hey, you know what? And I'm not trying to be mean. I'm not trying to be rude or anything in that way. But I'm just saying this. Don't let something stupid ruin the fellowship that we have here in this church. Don't let something about the color of the carpet or the color of the paint on the walls or whether this particular style of something happens or doesn't or whatever it may be. Don't let what somebody else says sit and get into your crawl and begin to work it over to the point where it becomes unhealthy. Don't allow that. Have a right attitude about the situations you're involved in. You know what? Secondly, from verse 7 down to verse 13, there needs to be a right handling of situations, a right handling of issues. There will be issues, and there will be issues that need to be handled. No doubt about it. You understand, the more people we have, the more issues we have. That's a natural law of life. The greater the number, the greater the problems that surround that number. And so not only do we need to have a right attitude about the things that are going on, but we need to have the right handling of issues. Notice what Nehemiah says. He was very angry in verse 6. But you know what he doesn't do? He doesn't right away go out and handle them in anger. Look at verse 7. He says, then I consulted with myself. You know what? Sometimes you got to stop, and when you're angry, sit down and realize, ask yourself, am I actually justified in being angry? Is this a big deal? Is this going to cause irreparable harm to someone? Is this going to... And you need to sit down and ask yourself those questions. Or maybe you need to find somebody else that you can trust and say, hey, am I looking at this wrong? Am I wrong for being angry about that? You need to find somebody that will tell you you are wrong. That is a valuable person in your life. The person that will look you in the eye and say, you know what, I think you're wrong about this. Don't reject that person. That's a valuable person in your life that would love you enough to say, something's wrong here. You need that in your life. And you know what, Nehemiah, he consulted with himself, but then he says this in verse 7, he says, and I rebuked the elders and the rulers, and said unto them, ye exact usury, everyone his brother. And I set a great assembly against them. You know what happens here? There's a consultation, there's a rebuke, there is an assembly, there's a restoration, there's a recommitment. Verse 7 down to verse 13 here. And Nehemiah doesn't just go out and just half-cocked and just blow everybody away and just deal with it. You know what he does? He handles it in a fashion that says, okay, there is a problem, so we're going to handle the problem properly. I have served underneath of managers that handled issues properly and improperly. And you know what? The issue was handled, but most often the guy that handles it right doesn't have to deal with it again a second time. Or if he does, then everything is very clear and it's just as easy the second time around. I'm trying not to give specific examples in that way, but I think you get it. If you've ever been in any kind of workplace at all, you know the manager that just comes in and just reams you up and down for something that you did when he could have just come in and said, okay, here's the issue, here's the problem, here's how it's going, and go on down the line. What is it? We need to handle things properly. What does it mean? That means maybe going to that person or leaving it up to leadership or doing whatever the situation occurs. To be honest with you, I think one of the greatest things that you can do when problems develop in your life is not tell anybody and just pray about it. If you have a problem with somebody else in the church, one of the greatest things you can do is tell absolutely nobody but God. And He will either change your heart if you're wrong about it, or He'll change that person. But you know what comes in is we struggle to do that. And so what is it? We need to handle things correctly. We need to have not only a right attitude, but a right handling of issues. And then if you go down towards the end of the chapter, again, I'm not going to take a ton of time more on this, but in verse 14 down to verse 17, towards the end of the chapter, verse 19, you know what we also have? We need to have a right attitude. We need to have a right handling of issues, but then we just need to be a right example. You know what Nehemiah says here down in verse 14, down to verse 19? He begins to explain how while everybody else is going through hard times, they're being taxed above measure, their kids are going into bondage because they don't have the food and all the money that goes along there. You know what Nehemiah says? At the end of verse 14, he says this, I and my brethren have not eaten the bread of the governor. Because he was the governor of Jerusalem at that time, he had the right to demand of the people a certain amount of money and food and everything to sustain his needs. And you know what Nehemiah says? He says, I didn't take anything from you guys. I didn't take anything. He says, I did it. I didn't fear because I feared the Lord. I haven't taken any money from you. I haven't taken any bread from you. And you know what we need to have? We need to be right examples of sacrifice. Right examples of sacrifice. What does that mean? That means sometimes we just need to be the one that just takes it and doesn't say anything about it. We need to have the right example of somebody that fears God. We need to have look at verse 16. It says this, Yea, also I continued in the work of this wall. You know what we need? We need some people that will be the right example of just putting their head down and laboring and doing what they're supposed to do. And then the last one, in verse 17, he says this, Moreover, there were at my table 150 of the Jews and the rulers, besides those that came unto us from the brethren, or from the heathen that are around it. And he ends up feeding people. So what is it? We need some people that have a right attitude about what's going on, will handle the situations rightly when they come up, but then will be a right example of sacrifice and ministry and labor. Many times we can affect the people that are around us not by the words that we say, but by what we do, how we act, the example that we lay out to them. And we need some people that are willing to just put their head down, do what they're supposed to do, labor, minister, sacrifice, fear God, and you know what will happen? The wall will get built. And the troubles begin to get minimized, and the troubles begin to get dealt with, and God's able to do something amazing, and God ends up dealing with Sanballat and Tobiah and all the things that go along with it, and the wall gets built in record time. We talked about it in the early chapters of Nehemiah, but they build somewhere around 2.5 miles, 2 to 2.5 miles of wall within the matter of a couple months. NDOT can't do that. Amen? You know what I'm saying? I mean, that's by hand, brick and mortar. That's crazy. Multiple feet high. I mean, just in months. So how is that? They maintain a right attitude. They handled things correctly, and they became a right example of sacrifice and ministry and fearing God and in labor, and it allowed them to steer clear of some trouble that could have hurt them very badly when it comes to the wall. Why? Because you know what? If everybody's in bondage and everybody's worried about their own self and everybody's getting worried about the taxing of the king and everybody's at odds with one another and fighting with one another, no bricks get put on the wall. And so as we go forward in the next year or so, as we go through this time, it's going to be a year, it's going to be 2 years. As we go through these things, be aware of the attack of the enemy from within and maintain a right attitude as well as we go through it. All right? That's the message for tonight. We're going to take a couple prayer requests here. Have a couple things. Miss Nikki and Brother Jeff had their baby yesterday. 6 pounds, 11 ounces, 19 inches long. Phoebe Irene Peterson. So they're doing great. They came home today, and so doing very, very well. So just continue to pray for them and the baby. And then Miss D called me just before church here a little bit, and Brother Lee is in the hospital. He's been in the hospital since Monday. He has a blockage in his lower intestine, and has probably had it about a week. It didn't go into the hospital for the first couple days, but they're trying to drain some of it before they actually have to do any kind of surgery. So she said everything is going well for what they're doing, and so hopefully he continues to go forward and then can have surgery on that. But pray for Brother Lee Knight in that. He is in Franciscan